May 7, 1945. A quiet afternoon in a mansion just outside Frankfurt, Germany. Outside those walls, American soldiers are losing their minds with celebration, firing guns into the sky, drinking, screaming with joy because Germany has finally surrendered. The nightmare is over. But inside one particular room, George Patton sits across from Dwight Eisenhower, and he is not celebrating at all. These two men just helped save the world, but Patton came here with something heavy on his mind, something that would destroy his career and make headlines call him insane. He looks Eisenhower straight in the eye and says something that changes everything. We are going to have to fight them eventually, so let us do it now while our army is intact and we can actually win. He is not talking about the Germans. Their empire is already in ruins. He is talking about the Soviet Union. Eisenhower just stares at him for a moment, probably thinking about the 3 years he spent holding together this fragile alliance with Stalin, balancing egos and ideologies just to beat Hitler. Back home in America, newspapers are calling Stalin Uncle Joe like he is some friendly neighbor. Newsreels show the Red Army as heroes. School kids are collecting scrap metal to help their Soviet allies. And here is Patton, the most aggressive general America has, calmly suggesting they should turn around and attack that same ally before the dust even settles. Eisenhower finally responds. George, you do not understand politics. The war is over. We are going home. In that moment, Patton realizes something terrifying. Eisenhower actually understands what he is saying. On some level, Ike knows Patton might be right, but he also knows he will never act on it. The political cost is just too high. What happens next is one of the most important silences in American history. A window of opportunity, if it even existed, closes without a single shot being fired. Now, Patton did not come up with this idea out of nowhere. His Third Army pushed deeper into Central Europe than any other Allied force. His tanks rolled across Germany into Czechoslovakia, right up against the line separating Western forces from Soviet territory. Everywhere he went, he saw something that disturbed him more than fighting the Germans ever did. He saw the Red Army, and what they were doing shocked even men who had seen years of brutal combat. His intelligence teams sent back reports that painted a dark picture. Soviet troops were not acting like temporary liberators passing through. They were acting like conquerors planning to stay. Reports came in about systematic looting, entire towns stripped of machinery and livestock, trains loaded with stolen equipment heading back east. There were accounts of mass rapes, brutal reprisals against civilians, summary executions of anyone suspected of being anti-communist. Whole communities were being rounded up and shipped to Soviet labor camps. Patton was not naive about war. He had seen plenty of cruelty. But what he witnessed in Eastern Europe convinced him that the Soviet Union was not a partner in some new democratic world order. It was a totalitarian empire pushing its borders west. In April 1945, he wrote to his wife with typical bluntness, saying he had no desire to understand the Russians sentimentally, only to figure out how much firepower it would take to stop them if it came to that. They gave him the impression of a force that must be feared in any future arrangement of world power. While diplomats in Washington still hoped Stalin would keep his promises about free elections and national self-determination, Patton was watching those promises crumble in real time. He met American prisoners of war who had fallen into Soviet hands near the end of the fighting. Their stories disturbed him more than anything they experienced under German captivity. They talked about having their watches, boots, and rations stolen. Officers who complained were beaten or shot. Some actually said they preferred their German captors to their Soviet allies. The pattern kept. repeating. Soviet units dismantled entire German factories piece by piece, loading industrial plants onto railcars to ship them east. In Poland, Romania, Hungary, and Bulgaria, Soviet-backed communists were moving into government ministries, police stations, and courts. Resistance fighters who risked everything fighting the Nazis were now being arrested, interrogated, and often executed, not by the Gestapo anymore, but by Soviet security forces. By the time Germany surrendered, Patton had developed a detailed assessment. What he proposed to Eisenhower and later to officials in Washington was not some angry outburst from a warrior who could not accept peace. It was a strategic plan built on intelligence reports, battlefield experience, and a brutal reading of Soviet capabilities and weaknesses. His logic was harsh but simple. The Soviet Union paid an unbelievable price to defeat Germany. Around 27 million of their people were dead. The Red Army, though massive, had been bled dry. Their forces in Eastern Europe were stretched thin, far from supply bases, living off captured depots and whatever they could take from occupied lands. Their supply lines stretched back thousands of miles to a country devastated by war. American forces, on the other hand, stood at the absolute peak of their power. They had overwhelming air superiority. Their supply lines ran back through France to Atlantic ports, backed by an industrial machine that enemy bombs never touched. American divisions were fully equipped, well-fed, and supported by fleets of bombers that could wreck Soviet transportation and communication networks. Patton told Under-Secretary of War Robert Patterson in May 1945 that they could beat the Russians in 6 weeks. The Soviets had no real strategic bombing capability. Their anti-aircraft defenses were limited. American air power alone could destroy Soviet logistics. On the ground, Soviet tank production was impressive in numbers, but after years of continuous fighting, their armored units were worn down and mechanically unreliable. American Sherman tanks might not be as heavily armored as some German or Soviet models, but they were dependable, and there were huge numbers of them ready for combat. What struck Patton most was the human factor. Soviet soldiers fought with incredible ferocity defending their homeland, but now they were being asked to occupy foreign countries and police populations that did not want them there. Many of these troops had little enthusiasm for permanent occupation duty. If an American offensive drove east, Patton predicted Red Army morale would collapse. He was convinced many Soviet soldiers would surrender, desert, or simply refuse to fight. Then came the most controversial part of his plan. He proposed arming the Germans. Across Europe, hundreds of thousands of former German soldiers sat in prisoner-of-war camps with uncertain futures. Many feared and hated the Russians far more than they hated the Americans or British. In Patton's view, those men could be re-equipped and turned against the Soviets. He even wrote that he would rather have a German division on his side than a Soviet one. To political leaders in Washington, this suggestion was absolutely horrifying. The United States just sacrificed enormous treasure and blood defeating Nazi Germany. To arm German troops again, even under Allied command, felt like betraying everything the war had been fought for. But Patton's reasoning followed ruthless logic. If the Soviets were the next threat, why not use enemies of that enemy to stop them? Within weeks, some of his remarks leaked to the press. The picture painted was not of a strategic thinker making difficult calculations, but of a reckless warmonger who had gone too far, someone sympathetic to Germans and obsessed with starting another war. Eisenhower had reasons to reject the plan beyond fear of bad press. The American public desperately wanted their sons home. Congress was already demanding rapid demobilization and warning against new European entanglements. Logistically, American forces had positioned themselves to occupy Germany, not push deeper into Poland and beyond. Supply lines would need complete reorganization at enormous cost. But beneath these practical obstacles lay something more decisive. Politics. Harry Truman had only recently become president after Roosevelt's death. He was still settling in, still surrounded by Roosevelt's advisors, still publicly committed to cooperation with Stalin. At Yalta, the Allies agreed on a framework for post-war Europe that promised free elections in liberated countries. To propose attacking the Soviet Union would look like tearing up solemn commitments. Eisenhower understood this perfectly. If he presented a plan like Patton's to the president, he would be branded a warmonger trying to ignite a new world war just as the previous one ended. The press would destroy him. Congress would turn against him. His reputation as the calm, steady architect of victory would shatter. He also genuinely believed diplomacy offered a path forward. Like many leaders then, Eisenhower hoped that once the war emergency passed, the Soviet Union would moderate, tensions would ease, and the newly formed United Nations could manage disputes. He thought in terms of institutions, treaties, and political processes. Patton thought in terms of opportunity and force. Eisenhower told his chief of staff that George sees the world as a battlefield and does not understand that we have to live with these people. Patton was not entirely alone in his thinking. Across the Channel, Winston Churchill was reaching similar conclusions. Churchill distrusted Bolshevism since the Russian Revolution of 1917. He only allied with the Soviets out of necessity to defeat Hitler. As the war wound down, he warned that Soviet aims did not stop with driving out the Nazis. By April 1945, Churchill was sending increasingly urgent messages to Truman and Eisenhower, urging them to push Western forces as far east as possible before the Red Army cemented control. He wanted American and British troops, not Soviet ones, entering Berlin, Prague, and Vienna. On May 12, 1945, Churchill used a phrase that would become famous. He wrote to Truman that an iron curtain has been drawn down upon their front, and behind it, freedom was being strangled. That same month, Churchill asked his military planners to draft something bold and unsettling called Operation Unthinkable. It was essentially an Allied offensive aimed at pushing Soviet forces out of Poland and Eastern Europe using rearmed German units alongside British and American divisions. The British chiefs of staff studied the idea and reached a sobering conclusion. Under the right conditions, if launched immediately, they believed it was militarily possible. It would be costly and require full commitment, but it might succeed in driving the Red Army back. Churchill forwarded the plan to Truman. The American president barely hesitated before rejecting it. The thought of attacking the Soviet Union, especially with German soldiers under Allied command, revolted him. The political and moral implications were too enormous. When Patton learned Churchill had entertained the same strategy, he felt bitterly vindicated. At least one man in power understands what we are facing, he told his staff. Within months, Churchill's fears started coming true. Soviet control over Eastern Europe hardened. Promised elections were delayed, manipulated, or cancelled. Opposition leaders vanished into prisons or graves. Communist parties backed by Soviet security took command of police forces, bureaucracies, and the press. Back in the United States, media coverage of Patton shifted dramatically. During the war, he had been portrayed as a colorful, controversial hero. In May and June 1945, the tone changed. Journalists seized on his harsh Soviet comments and his suggestion about rearming Germans. Columnist Drew Pearson described his statements as deeply troubling, suggesting the general's judgment might be slipping. At a moment when the country longed for peace, Patton seemed intent on courting another catastrophe. Editorials argued his remarks showed dangerous ignorance of diplomatic reality. Magazines wondered if this brilliant battlefield commander simply could not adapt to peacetime. None of these outlets seriously investigated the reports his intelligence teams were sending from Eastern Europe. They did not examine Soviet atrocities or the systematic installation of puppet governments. The narrative hardened. Patton was a superb warrior but an unstable relic unsuited to the new era. Pressure on Eisenhower increased. By August 1945, Washington officials made clear that Patton's public criticisms were unacceptable. The trigger came from a completely different issue: denazification. At a press conference, Patton was asked about efforts to purge all former Nazi Party members from German administration. He responded with characteristic bluntness, arguing many joined the party for practical reasons, not ideological fervor. Removing them all was idiotic. He compared it to American politics, saying Nazi Party membership was often no more serious than being a Democrat or Republican at home. The remark exploded. Reported without context, it sounded like Patton was equating participation in a murderous regime with normal political affiliation. Headlines accused him of trivializing Nazi crimes. Politicians denounced him. The controversy gave Eisenhower the excuse he needed. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of Third Army Command. Officially, the reason was inappropriate denazification comments. Unofficially, everyone understood his relentless Soviet warnings played an equally large role. Stripped of command, Patton spent his final months observing, writing, and warning. His letters from October and November 1945 read like prophecy mixed with military analysis. He urged American leaders to maintain strength, keep boots polished and bayonets sharp, show the Red Army unmistakable power. That, he insisted, was the only language Moscow respected. If the United States disarmed and relaxed, victory over Germany would be hollow. They might have defeated one enemy only to surrender the field to another. In early December, Patton met again with Under-Secretary Patterson and laid out his bleak forecast. The Soviets would not withdraw from Eastern Europe. They would transform temporary occupation into permanent control. They would spread communism through Western Europe by subversion, intimidation, and force. Eventually, America would face military confrontation with them. We are going to fight them eventually, he repeated. In 5 or 10 or 20 years, we will wish we had done it in 1945 when we had the chance. Patterson listened politely, then gave the same answer Eisenhower had in more bureaucratic form. Washington had no appetite for confrontation. The American public wanted peace, not another crusade. Whatever Patton saw on the ground, his proposed response was politically impossible. 3 days later, on December 9, 1945, Patton's staff car was involved in a collision near Mannheim. A truck suddenly turned in front of his vehicle. The general was thrown forward, suffering severe neck injury that left him paralyzed from the shoulders down. Other passengers escaped with minor wounds. Patton, who survived countless battlefield dangers, was mortally injured in what appeared to be a routine traffic accident. He lingered in a hospital bed nearly 2 weeks, unable to move. On December 21, 1945, George Patton died at age 60. The timing and strange circumstances fueled immediate speculation. Some pointed to odd driver explanations. Others noted the coincidence that the general most outspoken about the Soviet threat was silenced days after making a final dire prediction to Washington. But no credible assassination evidence ever surfaced. The more sober conclusion is tragic accident, one that nevertheless removed the loudest voice demanding confrontation with Moscow at its weakest moment. In following years, events unfolded in patterns eerily echoing Patton's warnings. By 1946, Soviet power in Eastern Europe was entrenched. Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria all fell under communist control. Free elections promised at Yalta proved a mirage. In Poland, resistance leaders who fought Nazis for 6 years were arrested on fabricated charges and either executed or sent to Soviet labor camps. In Czechoslovakia, a communist coup in 1948 overthrew the democratic government. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk died in a mysterious window fall, officially ruled suicide but widely suspected murder. The pattern repeated everywhere. Soviet presence was followed by communist government installation, opposition suppression, property nationalization, and secret police creation loyal to Moscow. Between 1945 and 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe and the wider Soviet bloc killed roughly 1 million people. Millions more were imprisoned, tortured, or subjected to everyday repression. The Iron Curtain Churchill envisioned became literal borders of barbed wire, concrete walls, and watchtowers. The Cold War Patton wanted to preempt lasted roughly 45 years, costing trillions in arms spending and millions of lives in proxy conflicts from Korea to Vietnam, Afghanistan to Angola. By 1949, the Soviet Union detonated its own atomic bomb, ending American nuclear monopoly and ushering in an age of mutual annihilation. By 1950, confronted with North Korean aggression backed by Moscow and Beijing, the United States found itself in the exact military clash with communist forces Patton predicted, except under far more dangerous conditions. Patton's argument was never that war with the Soviets could be avoided altogether. His claim was that surrender in 1945 was the least dangerous time to confront them militarily. The Red Army was exhausted. Soviet industry was shattered. American power peaked. If showdown was inevitable, better face it then than wait for Soviets to regroup, rearm, and acquire nuclear weapons. Whether his military assessment was entirely correct remains debated among historians. What is less debatable is that the broad outline of his warnings was borne out by events. Soviet occupation became effectively permanent until the late 1980s. Communist expansion spread globally. Military confrontation with communist forces occurred repeatedly at high cost. By 1947, even liberals who supported Roosevelt's hopeful Moscow approach had to admit something fundamental went wrong. George Kennan's famous long telegram from Moscow described the Soviet regime as inherently expansionist and ideologically committed to undermining the West, language that in more measured tone closely mirrored Patton's visceral 1945 warnings. The Truman Doctrine announced that year committed America to containing Soviet influence wherever it spread. Yet containment came with tragic trade-offs. It accepted Soviet control over Eastern Europe as grim reality, drawing the line further west. It meant fighting limited Asian wars instead of risking general European conflict. It meant living decades under nuclear annihilation shadow. Conservative critics later seized on Patton as prophetic figure who saw what others refused to see. General Douglas MacArthur, who clashed with Truman over Korean war strategy, wrote that Patton understood communism's nature and knew it required military confrontation. His removal, MacArthur argued, was tragedy with long-term consequences. Decades later, Ronald Reagan invoked Patton's warnings, arguing America must adopt strength and moral clarity toward what he called the evil empire. When the Berlin Wall crumbled in 1989 and the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, some conservatives pointed back to Patton's May 1945 Eisenhower conversation. Reagan's military buildup and confrontation policy, they argued, validated Patton's instincts. If the Soviet system could ultimately be broken by pressure, perhaps in some alternate history where Patton's advice was heeded, Eastern Europe might have been freed 45 years earlier. But whether Patton's proposed offensive would have succeeded is ultimately unanswerable. The political reality of 1945 made his plan almost unimaginable for democratic leaders. No matter its military chances, the United States and Britain were weary, their people desperate for peace. They just emerged from a cataclysm whose horrors were still being uncovered in death camps. To ask those societies to launch another war immediately against a recent ally was asking something they were almost certainly incapable of providing. Patton's tragedy was not simply being right. It was possibly being right at a moment when his country could not act on that truth. His story poses questions that have not gone away. When should America confront emerging threats militarily rather than relying on diplomacy and hope? How far should generals go advocating strategies that are militarily sound but politically impossible? When do political leaders have duty to ignore public opinion and act preemptively? And when does such action become recklessness? Similar debates echoed after September 11th attacks when policymakers argued over using preemptive force against terrorist networks and state sponsors. They echo again as America grapples with China's rise and expanding influence. Do you confront a rival power early while strength balance favors you? Or wait and hope engagement and negotiation moderate their ambitions? Patton represents one pole of that argument, the warrior believing threats should be crushed while vulnerable. Eisenhower in 1945 represented the other, the coalition builder believing in diplomacy, institutions, and slow political grinding. In that sense, Eisenhower's handling of Patton can be read two very different ways. One interpretation says the system worked as designed. A general refusing civilian guidance was relieved. Military power remained subordinate to elected authority. Another interpretation says the system failed. A general correctly identifying looming strategic danger was sidelined because warnings were inconvenient and uncomfortable. Eisenhower himself later acknowledged underestimating the Soviet threat nature in early post-war years, but never conceded Patton's suggestion of immediate military action was wise or feasible. From his perspective, politics, troop morale, and obligation balance made such moves irresponsible. Patton did not care about political feasibility. He cared about defeating what he saw as America's next enemy before that enemy grew stronger. That was the lens through which he viewed history, war, and his own duty. He died December 21, 1945, in a German hospital bed, paralyzed, far from front lines he loved. At his request, he was buried not in Grand National Cemetery in America, but among Third Army soldiers in Luxembourg, men with whom he fought and bled. In death, Patton became larger than life, a symbol onto which different groups projected beliefs. To many conservatives, he embodied clarity and courage to name evil and advocate force when necessary. To many liberals, he symbolized militarism's dark side, the man too easily reaching for war as solution. To most of the public, he remained the fiery tank commander who helped break Hitler's grip on Europe. The question of whether he was right about the Soviet Union was answered not by arguments but by events. Permanent Soviet domination of Eastern Europe for decades, global communist expansion, and a Cold War reshaping world politics until the 20th century's end. Whether his chosen remedy would have prevented that history or plunged the world into something worse, we will never know. What we do know is George Patton saw in spring 1945 a danger others preferred not to face. He spoke about it bluntly, refused to be quiet, and paid for that refusal with his career and possibly his life. Leaders who dismissed his warnings spent the next 45 years struggling to manage consequences of the reality he tried to confront. His voice still echoes, a reminder that there are moments when the person seeing most clearly is also the one most easily labeled dangerous, unhinged, or extreme. Sometimes the prophet is pushed aside, the truth-teller silenced, and the warrior insisting on naming the next enemy is removed by politicians who would rather enjoy victory than face the next storm gathering beyond the horizon.